A beautiful sound. I'm sure you're able to recognize that as a toilet flushing. And there we have the throne sitting right in front of us, nice and green of all colors. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Just keep toilet in the back of your head. Let's come up to this picture. And I want you to look at it, and I just want you to consider what you see. And one of the things that I hope you can appreciate is the idea of cause and effect. If we were looking at this picture, we see a couple of different things. We see this kid right here who has a bit of a sheepish look on his face. We see this dude over here who got the raw end of that deal with the teeter-totter to the chin. And we see him communicating his pain to this angry woman up on top. We're going to assume that that's probably his mother. And in her rage, she decides to do something about the problem. So she gives this kid a swift boot. And that takes care of the problem. With all of this, we can read consequences of certain actions. And that is what homeostasis is all about. So as we consider this whole idea of cause and effect, let's first define what homeostasis is. When we think about homeostasis, we're thinking about balance. And that's why I like to use a teeter-totter. So let's get out our teeter-totter. And right now, that teeter-totter is in balance. We also recognize that the teeter-totter can move, right? The teeter-totter can move in that direction. The teeter-totter can move in that direction. As far down as it can, at least to the ground anyway. And so you can appreciate that maybe it goes up that far. Likewise, it can move there. So we see this dynamic range in which this teeter-totter can move. Within all of this, we see right here, first and foremost, what we call set point. Set point is where the teeter-totter is when everything is balanced the way it should. We also see this wider range from here to here, what we would call the normal range. But the idea behind homeostasis is that with any movement, we want to be able to adjust parameters to allow us to put the teeter-totter back to this set point. So along comes this child, and this represents an external force that acts on this teeter-totter. This then becomes the stimulus. The stimulus tends to be external, and it tends to be beyond our control. So when that stimulus happens, we can see what happens. The teeter-totter is displaced downward, moving it away from set point. The goal of homeostasis is to put it back to set point. And in order to do that, the next thing we have to have is, we'll put this over on the other side, some sort of receptor. The job of the receptor is to detect a change in the variable. right? When we were over here talking about set point and normal range, this has to do with the variable. The variable is simply the thing that can change. And in this case, the teeter-totter's position represents the variable. Over here now we have the receptor, and the receptor can tell if the teeter-totter moves up or if the teeter-totter moves down. That's its job, is to determine and analyze the change in the variable. Next up, the receptor communicates that information to the control center. The control center's job is to interpret information from the receptor, then activate an effector to restore set point. And as we saw, that happens here as a boot comes off, in this case to get rid of the stimulus so that set point can be returned. This is a homeostatic feedback loop, and it represents negative feedback. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, consider a graph in which we were measuring blood glucose levels. For any one of us, the exact set point of our blood glucose is probably going to be a little bit different. For me, my fasting blood glucose is right around 79 milligrams per deciliter, so that would be right here my set point. But we also know that throughout the day, I mean, the first thing I do when I get up in the morning is I eat chocolate. And what does that do? It skyrockets my blood glucose. And so we have a normal range anywhere from 60 down to, or 60 up to 150 milligrams per deciliter, where this blood glucose can reside. And so I wake up in the morning, I eat chocolate, my blood glucose goes up. But then what happens? The blood glucose, as it increases, triggers cells in the pancreas to release insulin. And the job of insulin is to act on adipocytes or skeletal muscle to open up glucose channels to let glucose into the cells. And as glucose moves from the blood into those cells, blood glucose levels begin to go back down. And in fact, they go down below my set point. And so the body recognizes this and says, oh, we've got a problem. Now I sense low blood glucose, and from the alpha cells in the pancreas, I release glucagon. Glucagon travels to the liver, and the liver starts to break down glycogen, which is how I store glucose in my body, and glucose levels start to go back up. And so we see throughout the day, rather than a flat line, we see oscillations between the normal range where blood glucose lies. And all of this represents some type of feedback. So here we have defined our normal range. Negative feedback occurs as the body brings the variable back to set point. So if I was to look at this graph and identify all of the places where negative feedback is occurring, I would see negative feedback here, going back to set point. I would see negative feedback here, going back to set point. Negative feedback here, going back to set point, and here, and here, and here. All of these represent examples of negative feedback as the body is making adjustments to go back to set point once the variable has been disrupted. Now, we do need to contrast that with positive feedback, right? These are all examples of negative feedback. As we look at this graph, do we see examples of positive feedback? And this is important. The answer is no. Just because I'm going away from set point doesn't mean that positive feedback is occurring. You might consider, wow, look at this. I'm really going away from set point right there. That's fine, but it was because some stimulus triggered the variable to move away from set point. That's not positive feedback. Why? Because I'm still within normal range. However, if we come back over here and we see an instance where I continue to go away from set point beyond normal range, right? We saw normal range here and here. Going beyond normal range, this now becomes what we call positive feedback. And simply put, positive feedback either has to be fixed or you're going to die. It's not something that can be prolonged. Positive feedback isn't very common. There are some instances where it happens naturally in the body. A good example of this would be the birthing process, where the child reaches a critical mass and begins to put excessive amount of force, stretch on the cervix. And as the cervix stretches, the cervix sends signals to the hypothalamus, causing the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. The oxytocin then travels back to the uterus to induce uterine smooth muscle contractions. And as the uterus contracts, that increases the amount of force placed on the cervix. And so the signal goes back to the brain, releasing more oxytocin, causing the contraction to be a little bit harder, and then a little bit harder, and then a little bit harder. And so we see what positive feedback is in this sense, where it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse until the problem is rectified, right? Until, in this case, the child is born and the contractions stop. Most cases of positive feedback are the result of broken negative feedback. Now, to give an example of this, consider somebody with a really bad bleed, say a femoral bleed in the leg. In this case, the variable would be blood pressure. And as extensive bleeding occurs, the overall volume of blood in the system goes down. And with the decrease in volume, you see decreased pressure. Now, under normal conditions, what does the body do to increase blood pressure in order to go back to homeostasis? Well, the first thing the body's going to do is increase heart rate. But I hope you can appreciate that as you increase heart rate and therefore try to increase blood pressure, the force at which you're pumping blood out through the femoral artery, through the cut, is higher. And so you end up, while you're trying to rectify a situation, while you're trying to make the situation better, you end up making it worse than it was. So just to reiterate that point, most cases of positive feedback occur because negative feedback systems are broken. And positive feedback, by definition, is going away from set point beyond normal range. Okay, I want to come back here and I want to make sure we have everything labeled that we want. We've got variable, we've got set point, we've got normal range, we've got a receptor, we've got a stimulus. We talked about the effector, which is under control of the control center and whose job it is to change the variable. The one thing that we failed to mention earlier, these pathways. The communicative pathway from receptor to the control center is called an afferent pathway. And from the control center to the effector, this pathway here is called an efferent pathway. With that fresh in our minds, let's go back to the toilet and see if we can apply this knowledge to how a toilet works. Okay, so here's our toilet. If we were to kind of zoom in on this part, area of the basin that holds the water. This is what we're really interested in. If we drew this out real quick, what will we see inside? You see kind of this catch basin. There's a lid on top, but then we've got the flushing mechanism right here. What else is inside the toilet? Have you ever gone and explored the insides of a toilet? You should. It's really intriguing. You would find down here an outlet where the water is going to go into the bowl upon flushing it. Of course, covering that outlet, you've got this gasket. It's essentially called a flapper. And this flapper, hinged right there, is connected to a chain. And that chain is connected on the inside to a little bar that's associated with the handle. So from the outside, as a hand comes along to push this down, that gets depressed, that lifts this handle up, and as that chain gets lifted up, this flapper is displaced, and all of the water, draw the water in the bowl, all of the water is then able to leave into the bowl to flush the toilet. Now let's see if we can apply all of the scenario that we talked about above to the homeostasis of this toilet. First of all, what's the variable? The variable is the thing that changes. In this case, what changes? The level of water. So, there's my variable. It is right now at set point. Now, if we go back to the picture above, let's see if we can walk through this process. There must be a stimulus that changes the variable, and then there has to be a receptor that is able to pick up that change. So let's go back and see if we can apply that to our toilet. There's the stimulus, the hand, an external force that causes a change in the variable. As soon as that handle is pushed, the flappers open and the water leaves. What's the receptor? What senses the change? Well, in this case, there's a couple of different ways toilets can do this, but there is what's called a float. And this float is basically a floating ball that sits on top of the water. And this float is connected, we'll just draw it over here, to a valve, and that valve controls the flow of water. So piping from the house brings water into that system. Now, with the stimulus, as water levels begin to drop, what happens? The float begins to sink. And as the float sinks, the displacement of that arm as it bends opens a valve, allowing water to come back in and refill the toilet, restoring set point. So if we were trying to identify all of the terms, we've got our variable, we've got set point, we see the stimulus, we see here the receptor. Now it gets a little bit tricky. How can we apply the terms efferent pathway, afferent pathway, and control center? Remember, the job of the control center is to receive signals from the receptor and then do something about it. And so in this case, the valve here is the perfect setup for our control center. It's connected to the receptor here through an afferent pathway. This is how the receptor communicates to the control center. Now, the job of the control center is to work an effector. And in this case, the effector, by definition, also has to be able to change the variable. And so the valve box itself works as the control center and the effector, because as soon as that's on, we're able to open it up. So the effector would be the little valve inside of here that, when open, allows water back into the toilet to restore our homeostatic set point.